Okay, hi guys. Okay. So we have our final selection of Adorno readings to discuss tonight. I didn't get any volunteers for presentations, unfortunately, last week for this week at all. So I also don't have any other notes anyone posted there. But what I'd like to do is talk about the Adorno readings and also, have more of a kind of a summary discussion of everything we've been dealing with in the course. So the first thing that I wanted to do is kind of review two ideas that we talked about last week with Lukács and also this week with Adorno. And that is the concept of reification that Adorno returned to in negative dialectics, but that is really central to all of his discussions in the readings we've been doing this week. So I think that I might have mentioned that Walter Benjamin, his friend and colleague and mentor, Walter Benjamin said that Adorno was his only student, and Benjamin was converted to Marxism by Lukács's History and Class Consciousness book. So the concept of reification is very central to Benjamin and therefore for Adorno as well. It's also influential for the other Frankfurt School thinkers, Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse. There's actually a text by Marcuse that I might want to also make reference to tonight, and that is the Note on Dialectic. It's a note on dialectic. Let's bring that up now. Which is from 1960. But is roughly contemporaneous with when Adorno is working on his negative dialectics. And Marcuse and Adorno were close colleagues for a very long period of time, over many years. And what we will look at from Marcuse is his introduction to a book that he wrote called Reason and Revolution on Hegel. There's also, you will see in the additional readings folder, there is a review of negative dialectics written by Gillian Rose. She wrote this and published it after Adorno's death in 1969 because the English translation of negative dialectics wasn't released until the 1970s, 1973. Okay, so all of this to say that part of what we're considering, especially in the readings for tonight, is the historical moment of the 1960s, which was a background factor for Adorno's negative dialectics, but really Adorno's negative dialectics is a much longer-term project. And we read as framing readings for Adorno's negative dialectics selections from his Minima Moralia book, as well as the essay Reflections on Class Theory, looking at Benjamin's theologico-political fragment to get at that concept of redemption. So one way of thinking about this is If you recall from our reading from Negative Dialectics, Adorno addressed the lament over reification. In other words, reification understood as a purely negative or baleful category, something to lament. That's not really what Lukács meant. When we read The Standpoint of the Proletariat, we looked at how Lukács accounted for the way the working class, in its struggle for proletarian socialism, had to inevitably work through reification. And that means that reification is actually a dialectical category. It's not just a pejorative or negative category. It certainly is a critical category, but a critical category in a dialectical sense. So what it would mean to have a dialectical approach to reification or kind of critical reification, or the critical approach to reification. How does reification point beyond itself? So just to remind ourselves of how reification is supposed to grasp the problem of capitalism, it's the disintegration of bourgeois social relations in capitalism. So bourgeois social relations, the social relations of labor, relations between people, relations to nature, and self-relations, relations to oneself, as well as to others and to nature. Those are the social relations of labor, which then are in self-contradiction and in crisis in capitalism. And reification is meant, the phenomenon of reification is meant to be a symptom of this disintegration of bourgeois social relations. It's actually a section of Negative Dialectics that I'm not sure that we got around to reading together, called The Logic of Disintegration. Another famous phrase of Adorno's, logic of disintegration. So understood according to this term, reification, which means to thingify, it's about how the object sinks to the level or reverts to the status of a thing. It becomes unknowable. So to use Kantian language, something is unknowable in itself. Robert Pippin described this as philosophy is concerned with our ways of knowing, not things in themselves or the world in itself, but rather as objects, which means that philosophy's main concern, its main object actually, is subjectivity, is the subject. And that means that there is a reciprocal relation between subject and object. It's not unidirectional or one-sided. So subjective idealism, objective idealism. It's actually meant to be, between Kant and Hegel, there's supposed to be a dialectic of subjective and objective idealism. So the object reverts to a thing, but it doesn't become entirely unknowable, but our knowledge of the thing, our grasp of it, our knowledge not only theoretically but practically. Knowledge is a category of practice as well. Reason is a category of practice, not just of theory. So not just our conceptual understanding or a theoretical view, but our practical engagement, our knowledge through practice, has a phantom-like character, a contemplative character. Our consciousness is reified, is a self-reified character to consciousness in both practice and theory. And our subjectivity, not just the object, but our subjectivity itself takes on a thing-like character to ourselves. So our subjectivity appears as a thing to us. Okay, so how to get beyond what would the self-overcoming of reification mean? It's very tricky, because what it means is that we don't really have the language for it. We don't really have the terminology for it. What we have, we don't have a philosophy for it. What we have is bourgeois philosophy in extremis. or the new is the old in distress, as Adorno put it in Reflections on Class Theory. We've attempted, there have been various attempts, to try to be philosophically adequate to this new situation, this opacity of the world and of things, in a variety of ways. So Adorno does mention these things. Certainly this is true of Heidegger. He really tries to think about this and think about a kind of constitutive limitation on thinking in a way that's different from Kant maybe treating the thing in itself as a limit. Because in fact, it's not that the thing in itself is a limit for Kant, it's just simply unknowable. So it's not a limit to knowledge, it's just not the way we know things. We know things as objects, as practical and theoretical objects. So we have Heidegger. We have the philosophy that doesn't even ask the question, and that would be analytic philosophy, including related phenomena in other sciences, other disciplines, what Adorno calls positivism. It's also what he calls nominalism, and nominalism is another strange term from the history of philosophy, deep history of philosophy, actually theology. So nominalism refers to a pre-bourgeois, a pre-Protestant Christian theology, Catholic theology. The idea that everything has its own rules, its own laws. All of God's creation, everything in God's creation is created by God to have its own purpose, its own rules, its own telos, its own nomos. Right, so nominalism, which has another connotation. Nominalism also suggests that something simply is what we call it, that something simply is what we name it. So there's nominalism in that way. But there's also nominalism in this theological sense. There's a colloquial sense of nominalism, or of the nominal status of something, the ostensible status of something, but then there's nominalism in a philosophical sense, and there's a subtle contradiction there. So also a Christian theologian that was very important to Heidegger, that's Duns Scotus. He had a doctrine of the univocity of being, meaning that there's being and then there are beings. So all beings speak with their own voice of creation. So everything speaks with its own voice, but it's all the voice of God. So all the different things speak their own voices, but all together, there's a univocity of being. So even though everything seems to behave according to its own rules, they're all unified in the mind of God, or in the knowledge of God, or in God's intention, in the intention of God's creation. It all comes together, but in a way that we can't know. We can only know each thing. But we know each thing as part of the greater thing, univocity of being. So nominalism, positivism, Heideggerian ontology, logic of being, these are all ways of trying to think beyond or avoid the problem of reification. Also, Heidegger had read Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, and in many respects he was trying to respond to it in his philosophy, trying to respond to Marxism. So Heidegger took Lukács's version of Marxism to be authentic to Marxism, because he also read Marx, Heidegger, and he found this to be a compelling matter, and was also troubled by reification, by alienation in capitalism, but did not believe in Marxism's promise, or more broadly, socialism's promise of getting beyond the metaphysics of capitalism or in overcoming reification. And this is why Heidegger thought that he was operating at a deeper level than Marxism, because he didn't think it was just about industrial capitalism. He thought it was about a longer Western tradition of philosophy. So it's Western metaphysics rather than capitalism. And that's very influential for postmodernism, and we have, in our own time, we have attempts to get beyond a kind of bourgeois metaphysics of labor and Kantian and Hegelian philosophy. And that is object-oriented ontology is an example of that in our more recently, and thing theory. Right? And the idea that intelligence permeates everything, that it isn't just a matter of intelligent beings as opposed to other beings, the way it was for Kant, but rather everything is imbued with intelligence, which, again, from a certain standpoint, is a return to this kind of univocity of being, kind of nominalism of medieval Christian theology. Right? Because if intelligence permeates everything, then what we're really talking about is the mind of God permeates everything. Even when it isn't put that way, that is the antecedent and the precedent for that kind of approach. So object-oriented ontology, thing theory, universal intelligence in all things, in matter and energy themselves. That would be a kind of restoration of theology. That would be a restoration of, since everything is God's creation, everything is an expression of God's intention. Okay. So, still, there's the question of overcoming reification on the basis of reification. What would the self-overcoming of reification be? So the Marxist view is that all these attempts to get beyond bourgeois philosophy have actually failed. So let's see what Gillian Rose has to say about this. So I will also say that the readings that we're doing for tonight on Subject and Object, Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, and Resignation are what Adorno called the dialectical epilegomena to negative dialectics, meaning they're written after he published Negative Dialectics, but can be considered part of the same project. So she writes that Negative Dialectics and Adorno's other book that was published posthumously, Aesthetic Theory, she says, they amount to an experimental attempt to state a method apart from its practice, when the special nature of that method is that it is inseparable from its practice. What is the practice that's being mentioned here? That would be the critical essayism. That is Adorno's main mode. So he wrote concrete essays about specific objects. She says, thus, these statements of a theory apart from the practice, or a method apart from the practice, she says, they thus complement Adorno's many writings on music, literature, philosophy, and sociology. She says, it might be said that the very decision to write Negative Dialectics was an admission of failure. If it is a failure, it is a magnificent and important one, she says. The large and varied corpus of writings by the many philosophers, sociologists belonging to the Frankfurt School have revolved since the 1930s, around the question which Marx posed in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, how do we now stand in relation to the Hegelian dialectic? They asked this question for the era and generation after Lukács'. The experiences of that generation included the triumph of fascism, the lack of any proletarian revolution, the establishment of doctrinaire Marxism in Eastern Europe, and the flourishing of non-dialectical philosophies and sociologies in Western Europe and America. Adorno began the first page of Negative Dialectics with the proposition that has become infamous: philosophy which once seemed obsolete lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead here. Because we've covered a lot of this. Adorno explains one of his motives for writing Negative Dialectics as the desire to transcend the official separation of pure philosophy and the substantive or formally scientific realm. Yet even those social scientists versed in the tradition of German social thought and sympathetic to the search for alternatives to philosophical and sociological positivisms may be disappointed to find that Adorno is a man with a message, and that the message is deeply pessimistic. It is that society and consciousness are almost completely reified. The concept and theories of reification are notoriously elusive. Adorno seems to mean that critical consciousness, including his own, is almost impossible. History, in some sense, has come to a halt. By the way, that is the Walter Benjamin concept of dialectics at a standstill. Negative dialectics is an attempt to break out of this unbreakable paradox and to invite others to do so too. But Adorno's message and his guilt at having survived Auschwitz make him write like the man whom he says that he became in his dreams, the emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier, as if his thinking was crippled from then on. This is not to say that his message is wrong. Anyone who is involved in the possibility of Marxism as a mode of cognition, sui generis, at a time when critical consciousness can no longer be even imputed to an ideal typical class, as Lukács could do in 1923 in History and Class Consciousness, must read Adorno's book. Okay, so let's look now at the Marcuse note on dialectic. We'll just read some passages from this. So this is, like I said, the introduction to Marcuse's book on Hegel called Reason and Revolution, written in 1960. Marcuse writes, "This book was written in the hope that it would make a small contribution to the revival, not of Hegel, but of a mental faculty which is in danger of being obliterated, the power of negative thinking. As Hegel defines it, thinking is indeed essentially the negation of that which is immediately before us. Or we could say thinking is indeed essentially the negation of that which is, negation of what is." Marcuse continues, "What does he mean by negation, the central category of dialectic? Even Hegel's most abstract and metaphysical concepts are saturated with experience of a world in which the unreasonable becomes reasonable and as such determines the facts, in which unfreedom is the condition of freedom and war the guarantor of peace. This world contradicts itself." So again, contradiction isn't just a matter of our thinking, it's in the world itself. And not in the world in itself, but as it appears to us through our practical engagement with it, through our social relations with it. Common sense and science purge themselves from this contradiction. But philosophical thought begins with the recognition that the facts do not correspond to the concepts imposed by common sense and scientific reason. In short, with the refusal to accept them. This is non-identity. This is Adorno's concept of non-identity, and also what Robert Pippin called attention to. Apart from Adorno's concept of non-identity, Pippin emphasized the contradiction between the ideals of a community and the reality of that community. To the extent that these concepts disregard the fatal contradictions which make up reality, they abstract from the very process of reality. The negation which dialectic applies to them is not only a critique of a conformist logic, which denies the reality of contradictions, it is also a critique of the given state of affairs on its own grounds. of the established system of life, which denies its own promises and potentialities. This is the approach to capitalism that we've been investigating in the course, which is that it's a critique of capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself, and it's the attempt to overcome capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. That's actually the way Lenin put it in his writings, that Marxism recognized that socialism was the attempt to overcome capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself. Marcuse continues, today, this dialectical mode of thought is alien to the whole established universe of discourse and action. It seems to belong to the past and to be rebutted by the achievements of technological civilization. The established reality seems promising and productive enough to repel or absorb all alternatives. Thus, acceptance and even affirmation of this reality appears to be the only reasonable methodological principle. Moreover, it precludes neither criticism nor change. On the contrary, insistence on the dynamic character of the status quo, on its constant revolutions, is one of the strongest props for this attitude. So remember that Adorno pointed out that the dynamic side of the dialectic is embraced by some Marxists and also by bourgeois opponents of Marxism. Yet this dynamic seems to operate endlessly within the same framework of life, streamlining rather than abolishing the domination of man, both by man and by the products of his labor. Progress becomes quantitative and tends to delay indefinitely the turn from quantity to quality. It's a Hegelian idea, the idea that quantity becomes quality. That is, the emergence of new modes of existence with new forms of reason and freedom. Meaning, are we going to stay stuck in bourgeois and now capitalist forms of reason and freedom forever? Is the transformation of freedom itself at a halt? Marcuse continues, the power of negative thinking is the driving power of dialectical thought, used as a tool for analyzing the world of facts in terms of its internal inadequacy. I choose this vague and unscientific formulation in order to sharpen the contrast between dialectical and undialectical thinking. Inadequacy implies a value judgment. Dialectical thought invalidates the a priori opposition of value and fact by understanding all facts as stages of a single process, a process in which subject and object are so joined that truth can be determined only within the subject-object totality. All facts embody the knower as well as the doer. They continuously translate the past into the present. In other words, they constantly translate what exists into action. The objects thus contain subjectivity in their very structure. Now, what or who is this subjectivity that, in a literal sense, constitutes the objective world? Hegel answers with a series of terms denoting the subject in its various manifestations: thought, reason, spirit, Geist, idea. Since we no longer have the fluent access to these concepts, which the 18th and 19th centuries still had, I shall try to sketch Hegel's conception in more familiar terms. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Actually, the next paragraph is good too. Nothing is real which does not sustain itself in existence, in a life and death struggle with the situations and conditions of its existence. The struggle may be blind or even unconscious, as in inorganic matter. It may be conscious and concerted, such as the struggle of mankind with its own conditions and with those of nature. Reality is the constantly renewed result of the process of existence. The process, conscious or unconscious, in which that which is becomes other than itself, and identity is only the continuous negation of inadequate existence, the subject maintaining itself in being other than itself. Each reality, therefore, is a realization, a development of subjectivity. The latter comes to itself in history, where the development has a rational content. Hegel defines it as progress in the consciousness of freedom. Again, a value judgment, and this time a value judgment imposed upon the world as a whole. But freedom is for Hegel an ontological category. It means being not a mere object, but the subject of one's existence. not succumbing to external conditions, but transforming factuality into realization. This transformation is, according to Hegel, the energy of nature and history, the inner structure of all being. One may be tempted to scoff at this idea, but one should be aware of its implications. All right, here I will jump ahead. Interpretation of that which is in terms of that which is not, confrontation of the given facts with that which they exclude, this has been the concern of philosophy wherever philosophy was more than a matter of ideological justification or mental exercise. The liberating function of negation in philosophical thought depends upon the recognition that the negation is a positive act. That which is repels that which is not, and in doing so repels its own real possibilities. Consequently, to express and define that which is, on its own terms, is to distort and falsify reality. Reality is other and more than codified in the logic and language of facts. Here is the inner link between dialectical thought and the effort of avant-garde literature. The effort to break the power of facts over the word and to speak a language which is not the language of those who establish, enforce, and benefit from the facts. As the power of the given facts tends to become totalitarian, to absorb all opposition and to define the entire universe of discourse, the effort to speak the language of contradiction appears increasingly irrational, obscure, and artificial. The question is not that of a direct or indirect influence of Hegel on the genuine avant-garde, though this is evident in Mallarmé and Vieille d'Ildarnum. In surrealism, in Brecht, dialectic and poetic language meet, rather, on common ground. The common element is the search for an authentic language, the language of negation, as the great refusal to accept the rules of a game in which the dice are loaded. The absent must be made present because the greater part of the truth is in that which is absent. This is Mallarmé's classical statement. I say flower, and out of the oblivion where my voice banishes all contours, musically rises, different from every known blossom, the one absent from all bouquets, idea itself and delicate. In the authentic language, the word is not the expression of a thing, but rather the absence of this thing. The word makes the things disappear and imposes upon us the feeling of a universal want and even of its own want. Marcuse continues, poetry is thus the power to deny things, the power which Hegel claims paradoxically for all authentic thought. Valère, who's another modernist poet, asserts, quote, in short, thought is the labor which brings to life in us that which does not exist. Valère asks the rhetorical question, what are we without the help of that which does not exist? Marcuse continues, this is not existentialism. It is something more vital and more desperate, the effort to contradict a reality in which all logic and all speech are false to the extent that they are part of a mutilated whole. The vocabulary and grammar of the language of contradiction are still those of the game. There are no others. But the concepts codified in the language of the games are redefined by relating them to their determinate negation. This term, which denotes the governing principle of dialectical thought, can be explained only in a textual interpretation of Hegel's logic. Here it must suffice to emphasize that, by virtue of this principle, the dialectical contradiction is distinguished from all pseudo and crackpot opposition, beatnik, and hipsterism. The negation is determinate if it refers the established state of affairs to the basic factors and forces which make for its destructiveness, as well as for the possible alternatives beyond the status quo. In the human reality, they are historical factors and forces, and the determinate negation is ultimately a political negation. As such, it may well find authentic expression in non-political language, and the more so as the entire dimension of politics becomes an integral part of the status quo. All right, I'm going to jump ahead here. The power of facts is an oppressive power. It is the power of man over man, appearing as objective and rational condition. Against this appearance, thought continues to protest in the name of truth, and in the name of fact. For it is in the It is the supreme and universal fact that the status quo perpetuates itself through the constant threat of atomic destruction, this is 1960, through the unprecedented waste of resources, through mental impoverishment, and, last but not least, through brute force. These are the unresolved contradictions. They define every single fact and every single event. They permeate the entire universe of discourse and action. They thus define also the logic of things, that is, the mode of thought capable of piercing the ideology and of comprehending reality whole. No method can claim a monopoly of cognition, but no method seems authentic, which does not recognize that these two propositions are meaningful descriptions of our situation. The whole is the truth, and the whole is false. So the whole is the truth is Hegel, and the whole is false is actually Adorno. Okay, so this is, I think that Marcuse is useful because he a little bit more explanatory and a little bit less opaque. Also just written originally in English by Marcuse rather than something that we have in translation that may or may not be good. Okay. So finally I want to bring up some terms that are in Adorno's final writings in Subject and Object, Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, and Resignation, so that we kind of have them in the back of our minds as we're reading. So the idea here is this kind of continuation of the chart on capitalist contradiction that we've looked at in class before. So here we're going to stick with one version of that contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, or between ideological superstructure and socioeconomic base, and that is the contradiction and dialectic of social being and consciousness. Okay, so what Adorno is getting at is a further degradation of this problem in capitalism in his own time. And what he does is he talks about the separation of theory and practice, not their dialectical interplay, but their divorce and opposition. And so this is a disintegration of consciousness between theory and practice. And social being becomes a function of what he calls practice-ism, or kind of reified practice. So there's practice-ism on the one hand, a kind of reified practice, which violates the notion of praxis, a kind of self-conscious practice. Practicism on the one hand, and contemplation on the other hand, so that theory becomes contemplative, the reified consciousness that Lukács addressed, but also another side of that reified consciousness is practicism, and that this is the form that object and subject take in their opposition. This can also be seen, the reification of the object, the reversion of the object into a thing, means the disintegration of the particular from the universal. So we have particularism versus universalism. We have a kind of divorce of the particular and the universal, where it's not clear how the particular is part of the universal, how it is a particularization of the universal, but rather seems to be a thing in itself. And similarly, the universal is reified or hypostasized as universalism, where how the universal arises from the particulars is lost, and it seems instead that the universal is imposed on the particular. And then finally, we'll see in the Marginalia to Theory and Praxis and Resignation, especially the piece Resignation, that we have a further degradation. So we not only have the degradation of theory and practice into practicism and contemplation, but we also have the degradation of practice into mere acting, or actionism, the reification of action. And that contemplation, theory as contemplative, is degraded into mere thinking, right, where it's not theory in the Kantian sense of his first critique, the critique of pure reason, the faculties of the understanding or of concepts or theory, but just thinking unaware of its own conditions of possibility. In the same way that acting, becomes alienated from and unself-conscious of its conditions of possibility. So thinking and acting become isolated and divorced. Right, so this is what he's going to be tracing. Okay. Bring up the readings. Actually going to start with late capitalism or industrial society. So we'll sort of modulate our discussion of subject and object and theory and practice. Start with late capitalism or industrial society. So this is a speech that Adorno gave to the German Sociological Association in 1968. He published an English version of this essay in the United States in an American journal, and the title he gave it there was, "Is Marx Obsolete?" Okay, so here, late capitalism or industrial society. So the answer to is Marx obsolete for Adorno is no. And yet, Marx's apparent obsolescence in the 1960s itself is something that demands a Marxist approach, meaning the appearance of Marx's obsolescence, or Marxism's obsolescence, demands a Marxist critique. So how he tries to get at this, the obsolescence of Marx, is to think of the two ways in which that obsolescence appears. One is late capitalism, and the other is industrial society. So late capitalism is actually a kind of an old idea. By 1968, it's already an old idea. It's an idea from the early 20th century, and it is a kind of revisionist idea. It's an idea from revisionist Marxism, where the category of late capitalism seems to invalidate Marx's theoretical and practical perspective from the 19th century. So the idea is that capitalism had moved into late capitalism in the 20th century, and that this meant that Marx's theory as well as practice need to be modified. Now, another way of thinking about late capitalism is as imperialism. That would be Lenin's concept of the highest possible stage of capitalism, the kind of capitalism that was achieved in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which the revisionist Marxists thought meant going beyond Marx, both politically and intellectually, but that Lenin and others like Rosa Luxemburg, they thought, well, no, late capitalism is the highest stage of capitalism, meaning it's the stage in which capitalism demands to be overcome. And not only that, but it's a high stage of capitalism that is itself the product of the workers' struggle for socialism. So the workers' class struggle within capitalism had changed capitalism, had affected capitalism, had brought about this highest possible stage of capitalism, and had put proletarian socialist revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat, on the agenda. And so late capitalism is fraught with all these connotations. And the failure to overcome capitalism then would be to allow capitalism to decay into an overripe or rotten condition, as opposed to a condition in which it is ready to be overcome. It rather becomes overripe and it decays. Now that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, and then a decay of capitalism would also suggest a challenge to the validity of Marxism, or maybe point to Marxism's obsolescence. The other way of looking at it is industrial society. And industrial society is more positive in its view. And this is a term that was coined by Daniel Bell. And Daniel Bell was a graduate student assistant of the Frankfurt School when they were based at Columbia University. He was someone who was around left-wing circles, Marxist, communist, Trotskyist, socialist circles, that sort of left fellow traveler intellectual milieu in New York in the late 1930s and 1940s. He went on to be a post-Marxist theorist. And he thought that the Soviet Union and the United States, the leading countries in the Cold War, had gone beyond the ideology of capitalism and socialism or communism. So he called this the end of ideology. And rather than diverging, they were actually converging. So the Soviet Union and the United States were converging, and the difference between the US being capitalist and the Soviet Union being socialist was diminishing in favor of both becoming industrial society. Right, so industrial society was what succeeded the older form of capitalism that Marxism referred to. And that in overcoming that older form of capitalism, the Soviet Union had only taken the road of industrial society. And anyway, contemporaneously, the capitalist West had also gone beyond the traditional capitalism and had moved in this direction of industrial society. Right, so this is more of a positive kind of affirmation of the new situation, as opposed to late capitalism, which has this kind of sense of impasse in Marxism and what to do about it, and also what to do about the failure of the revolution. The industrial society idea assumes the success of the revolution, rather, and that the revolution didn't produce socialism, it produced this other thing called industrial society. Okay, so this is what he thinks are the alternatives. Right? And he says that this is the fundamental question of the present structure of society. Okay, so he's using the language of sociology. Sociology is all about structure and agency. How do people assert agencies within social structures? Right, it's the German Sociological Association. And he's speaking as an old-time Marxist and raising this question, is Marx obsolete? And he says, actually, behind this question of how to characterize the present structure of society as either late capitalist or industrial society lurks the question of whether or not Marx actually is obsolete. So implicitly, it's assumed that Marx is obsolete, but actually behind these characterizations and behind this question lurks the issue of whether actually Marx is obsolete, and if he is, how, and what does that mean? So what we could say again is that this is the imminent dialectical critique of the apparent obsolescence of Marxism through its contradictory forms of appearance, namely that society had moved either into a stage of late capitalism or rather into a stage of industrial society. So he addresses it as follows. In other words, the question is whether it is true that Marx is out of date. According to this claim widespread among sociologists today, the world is so completely determined by the unprecedented growth in technology that the social relations that once characterized capitalism namely the transformation of living labor into a commodity, with the consequent conflict between the classes, have now lost their relevance or can even be consigned to the realm of superstition. At the same time, we can note the unmistakable signs of convergence between the technically most advanced nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. In terms of living standards and consciousness, particularly in the most important Western nations, class differences are far less in evidence now than in the decades during and following the Industrial Revolution. The predictions of class theory, such as a pauperization or impoverishment and the collapse of capitalism, have been insufficiently realized for their meaning not to be distorted beyond recognition. To speak of relative pauperization is ludicrous. Even if Marx's by no means unambiguous law of the falling rate of profit had turned out to be true, we would have to concede that capitalism has discovered resources within itself that have postponed its collapse until the Greek kalends. That means the end of time. These resources include, at the top of the list, the immense growth in technical potential, and with it the vast increase in consumer goods available to all the members of the advanced industrial nations. At the same time, faced with this technical development, the relations of production have proved to be more flexible than Marx had expected. The criteria of class relations that empirical sociologists like to call criteria of social stratification, that is to say, distinctions of income, living standards, and education, are generalizations of findings about single individuals. In this sense, we may call them subjective. In contrast, the old definitions of class were meant to be objective, independent of indices derived directly from the lives of their subjects. However much such indices may express objective social realities, Marx's theory was based on the position of employers and workers in the process of production and ultimately referred to the ownership of the means of production. In the dominant schools of sociology today, this premise is rejected as dogmatic. The dispute needs to be resolved theoretically, not simply through the presentation of facts, which may well contribute to the critique, but may also, according to critical theory, obscure social structures. Even the opponents of dialectics are no longer willing to postpone indefinitely the development of a theory that takes account of the proper interests of sociology. The controversy is essentially one of interpretation, unless we are to banish the desire for a solution to the limbo of the non-scientific. A dialectical theory of society is concerned with the structural laws that govern the facts, manifest themselves in them, and are modified by them. By structural laws, it understands tendencies that follow more or less strictly from the historical constituents of the overall system. The Marxist models for this were the law of value, the law of accumulation, and the law of collapse. By structure, dialectical theory does not mean patterns, in which, as far as possible, sociological findings can be entered completely, continuously, and free from contradiction. Thus it means not systematic knowledge, but rather the system of society that exists prior to the procedures and data of scientific knowledge. Such a theory is the last to resist the facts, and may certainly not twist them in order to satisfy some preconceived thesis. For in that case, it would undoubtedly lapse into dogmatism and would repeat in the mind what the powers that be in Eastern Europe have enacted in reality through the instrument of dialectical materialism. That is to say, it would immobilize things that, according to their own logic, can only be conceived to be in motion. Thus, a fetishism of objective laws is created corresponding to the fetishism of facts. So you'll see he's covering a lot of the same ground that Marcuse was doing in the Note on Dialectic. A dialectical theory, overborne by the painful dominance of these laws, does not glorify them, but criticizes them, just as it criticizes the illusion that individual and concrete facts determine the course of the world. Under its spell, the individual and concrete probably do not yet even exist. The word pluralism lends support to the utopian belief that utopia already exists. It serves to mollify us. This explains why a dialectical theory that reflects on itself critically may not make itself at home in the medium of the universal. To break out of that medium is indeed its intention. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. So he's saying two things, right? So he's saying the facts shouldn't be fetishized, but also dialectics should not be fetishized. So dialectical theory should not be fetishized, and neither should the positive facts be, or the facts of positive theory be fetishized. All right, so the goal is to change the facts, but also to overcome the theory. So we've encountered this previously with Adorno's idea that beyond capitalism would be neither a system nor a contradiction, neither a totality nor a contradiction. And indeed that dialectics was itself self-contradictory now in capitalism, and so pointed beyond itself. So that means that a reality beyond capitalism would be undialectical or non-dialectical. It wouldn't have to undo dialectics exactly. It could simply be non-dialectical. But that to adopt that now, while still within capitalism, would mean remaining blind to capitalism. So to reject the dialectic while still in capitalism would mean to try to avoid or ignore the problem of capitalism, even if the problem of capitalism is itself built into the dialectic, and therefore the dialectic is implicated in capitalism. So if we reject dialectics, we're pretending capitalism is over. If we stick only to the facts, then we reject any systematic view of society and history. So he says, history finds it hard to part company. This is skipping ahead to page 115. History finds it hard to part company with the centerpiece of Marxian theory, the doctrine of surplus value. This was supposed to provide an objective economic explanation of class relations and the growth of class antagonism. But if thanks to technological progress and industrialization, the share of living labor, from which alone surplus labor is supposed to arise, shrinks and even becomes marginal, at least in tendency, this cannot but affect that core doctrine, the theory of surplus value. The current absence of an objective theory of value is determined not just by the school of economic thinking that almost alone enjoys academic respectability today, but also by the prohibitive difficulties in explaining the formation of classes objectively in the absence of a theory of surplus value. Right, so what he means by the school of economic thinking that almost alone enjoys academic respectability today, he means marginal utility theory, which basically rejects the labor theory of value or labor power becoming a commodity, and therefore would reject the theory of surplus value. He says, in terms of critical dialectical theory, I would like to propose as an initial necessarily abstract answer that contemporary society undoubtedly is an industrial society, according to the state of its forces of production. Industrial labor has everywhere become the model of society as such, regardless of the frontiers separating different political systems. It is developed into a totality because methods modeled on those of industry are necessarily extended by the laws of economics to other realms of material production, administration, the sphere of distribution, and those that call themselves culture. In contrast, however, society is capitalist in its relations of production. People are still what they were in Marx's analysis in the middle of the 19th century, appendages of the machine, not just literally workers who have to adapt themselves to the nature of the machines they use, but far beyond that. Figuratively, workers who are compelled right down to their most intimate impulses to subordinate themselves to the mechanisms of society and to adapt specific social roles without reservation. Production takes place today as then for the sake of profit. And far exceeding what was foreseeable in Marx's day, human needs that were potentially functions of the production apparatus have now become such functions in fact, rather than the production apparatus becoming a function of human needs. People are now totally controlled. Admittedly, even though they are fixed and adapted to the interests of the apparatus, human needs are still present, dragged along as it were, and the apparatus can therefore make an effective appeal to them. But the use value side of commodities has now lost all its remaining spontaneous naturalness. Not only are needs satisfied indirectly via their exchange value, but in the economically relevant sectors they are generated by the profit motive, even at the expense of the objective needs of consumers, such as adequate homes, to say nothing of education and information about the most important matters affecting their lives. In the realm of goods that go beyond the bare necessities of life, the tendency is for exchange value to become detached, consumed, a phenomenon that appears in empirical sociology in such terms as prestige and status symbols, although these do not capture their objective essence. I'm going to jump ahead here. The persistent predominance of the relations of production was not what Marx had hoped for. It was caused not least by the fact that society was able to absorb into itself what Veblen, who's a sociologist, termed the underlying population. Only a man who puts the happiness of the whole abstractly before that of living individuals might regret such absorption. For its part, this development depended on that of the forces of production. It was not identical, however, with their priority over the relations of production. The absorption of the underlying population should never be thought in mechanistic terms. To achieve the predominance of the forces of production would have called for the spontaneous action of those people who were interested in changing social relations, and by now their numbers have surpassed many times those of the industrial proletariat. However, objective interest and subjective spontaneity go in completely different directions. Spontaneity dried up under the disproportionate weight of the given. Marx's dictum that theory becomes a real force when it grips the masses was flagrantly overturned by the course of events. If the organization of society, whether by accident or design, uses the culture industry, the consciousness industry, and the monopolistic control of opinion to bar the way in which the most basic knowledge and experience of the most dangerous processes and the most essential critical ideas, and if, going far beyond that, society paralyzes people's ability to imagine the world in concrete terms as being anything other than it appears to be, then the fixed and manipulated state of mind becomes a real force, too. But it becomes the force of repression, which is just as potent in its own way as had been once upon a time its opposite, namely free spirit, which wished to do away with repression once and for all. He says the relations of production have not been revolutionized, and their power is greater than ever. However, at the same time, since they are objectively anachronistic, they are debilitated, damaged, and undermined. They no longer function autonomously. Economic intervention is not, as the older liberal school believed, an alien element grafted on from outside, but an intrinsic part of the system, the epitome of self-defense. Nothing could provide a more telling illustration of the concept of dialectic. One finds an analogy here with Hegel's philosophy of right, in which bourgeois ideology and the dialectic of bourgeois society are so deeply intertwined. Hegel summoned the state to assist the intrinsic dialectic of society, which he believed would otherwise collapse. He issued this summons even though the state was supposed to stand outside the conflicts of society and mitigate those social antagonisms with the aid of the police. Invasion by forces extrinsic to the system is likewise an instance of immanent dialectics for Hegel. Similarly, at the opposite pole, Marx conceived of the overthrow of the relations of production, both as imposed by the course of history and at the same time as caused only by an action qualitatively different from the coherent system of society. To the last page. The idea that the forces and relations of production are one and the same today, and that the notion of society can be easily constructed solely by reference to the forces of production, and the current shape of socially necessary illusion, or the necessary form of appearance. It is socially necessary because elements of the social process that were formerly separate, and this includes living human beings, have been brought down to a kind of common denominator. Material production, distribution, and consumption are administered jointly. Their boundaries flow into one another, even though earlier within the overall social process they were at once different from one another and related, and for that reason they respected what was qualitatively different. Everything is now one. The totality of the processes of mediation, which amounts in reality to the principle of exchange, has produced a second, deceptive immediacy. This enables people to ignore the evidence of their own eyes and forget difference and conflict, or repress it from consciousness. But this consciousness of society is illusion, because while it does justice to the process of technological and organizational standardization, it overlooks the fact that this standardization is not fully rational, but remains subject to blind, irrational laws. No overall social subject exists. We could formulate this illusion by saying that all social phenomena today are so completely mediated that even the element of mediation is distorted by its totalizing nature. It is no longer possible to adopt a vantage point outside the hurly-burly that could enable us to give the horror a name. We are forced to adopt its inconsistencies as our starting point. This is what Horkheimer and I meant when we spoke some decades ago of the technological veil, the false identity between the organization of the world and its inhabitants. An identity created by the expansion of technology amounts to the affirmation of the relations of production, for whose beneficiaries we seek today almost as vainly as for the proletarians, who have become all but invisible. The system has become independent, even of those who are in control, but this process has now reached its limits. It has now become fate, and finds its expression in what Freud called ubiquitous free-flowing anxiety. Free-flowing because it is no longer able to attach itself to living beings, whether to individuals or classes, but ultimately, what has been liberated are the relations between human beings that have been buried beneath the relations of production. Hence, the overpowering order of things remains its own ideology and is thus virtually impotent. Impenetrable though its spell is, it is only a spell. If sociology is going to do anything more than provide agents and interests with the information they want, if it is going to achieve anything of what was envisioned at its birth, it must face up to the task of employing methods that have not succumbed to universal fetishism, and thus make its contribution, however modest, to breaking this spell. Let's see how we're doing for time. I'm going to have us take a short break now. Let's take 5 or 10 minutes now, and then we'll come back. Okay, let's resume. So actually, Sumi had posted some notes. Okay, so, all right, we need to for the late capitalism or industrial society. Sumi, did you want to speak to these?
Hi, yes, I just have a few, just 2 questions regarding, the terms he used on the essay.
Mm-hmm.
On the second paragraph, Adorno calls social stratification subjective and class objective. what exactly makes one subjective and the other subjective is my question. The first question of the paragraph. And the second question is in paragraph 3, what does Adorno means by facts? If he says structures, condition, facts appear in fact and are modified by facts. I understand facts fetishizing is like the whole theme of the paragraph 3, but I wasn't quite sure like how the term is used in the context of the term facts.
Okay, so I think we could start with facts, which is the like empirical data. So sort of any empirical data. So I think one of the things, for instance, that he referred to was differences in income, but also differences in education. So, any kind of statistically processed data would be the facts of sociology. So, think about the way we would break down the election in the United States that took place last year in 2024. When people analyze the voting patterns, they break it down between educated, uneducated, white, black, Latino, male, female, age ranges, right? So when he says that those things are subjective, what he means is that they are looking at things from the standpoint of the individual, meaning that any particular individual could be classified as having this or that income level, this or that education, this or that racial identity, this or that gender identity, or this or that age, right? So all those things would be facts and would be, he thinks, looking at things from a subjective standpoint because they're looking at things from the standpoint of the individual. Right, like an individual position in society would be subjective. The job one has, the role that one has, the income that one has, again, social group identity that one has, education level that one has. It's analyzing things from the standpoint of the individual status or individual position within the structure. So one of the reasons why he's putting it just this way is to say that it assumes the structure. So it's subjective also because it assumes the structure. It's not objective in the sense of analyzing the structure itself. I don't know if that helps. I know this is an unusual way that he's using the language, but go ahead.
Yeah, I understood perfectly. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I should have. Yeah. Thank you.
No, it's a puzzle. It's unusual way of using language that he's doing here. Meaning, not unusual because it's like dialectical or Marxist or anything. Just this is more like technical. We might say technical language. So even when he says, all these kinds of data points are subjective, whereas the structure is objective, the sociologists of the time, and maybe even today, would accept that kind of a distinction. They would, that he's making. And so then it's not just that distinction, but it's further significance. So what he wants to say is that the subjective and the objective are not coming together. They don't sort of add up. So again, he's using this language in a way that might be unfamiliar to us, but not unfamiliar to the discipline of sociology. But he's still saying what this does is kind of naturalize the separation of these two spheres, the subjective and the objective. And whereas the point is to try to think about how they are related, and then also to think about what the significance of their appearing to be unrelated, meaning that we have a hard time relating them theoretically, the significance of that difficulty, why it is that we have a difficulty thinking about objective structure and subjective position. So all of that, he would say, like any disciplinary problem or methodological problem in sociology, he would say is itself a symptom of capitalism. Now, one thing that I want to point out, so we skipped over some parts of the essay in our close reading of it just now. He does take up a more controversial point for his audience, and that is the idea that the very discipline of sociology itself is a symptom. So this relates to what we were talking about in the last two class sessions about philosophy. That philosophy, continuing on, is a symptom of capitalism. That the fact that it hadn't overcome itself and merged with social reality in the way that Kant and Hegel imagined it would, the fact that philosophy is a separate discipline, and not only a separate discipline, but a very kind of strange, isolated discipline, an esoteric discipline, whether in the form of formal logic or in the form of speculative thinking, like Heidegger's ontology, that it itself is a symptom. Now, sociology seems to be the opposite of philosophy, because sociology seems to be about useful knowledge of society. It applies to policy. He's writing at the time, we might say, of the heyday of philosophy, middle of the 20th century. But he also wants to say that that's a symptom. That we are even trying to grasp society this way, sociologically, is a symptom, even in the discipline name itself, sociology, like the logic of society or the logic of the social. And he observes that the discipline of sociology itself was only invented in the era of industrial capitalism. So philosophy, on the other hand, is thousands of years old. But we talked about how philosophy kind of really overcame itself in a variety of ways. So traditional philosophy overcame itself in modern German idealist philosophy with Kant and Hegel. And then that philosophy that had overcome traditional philosophy goes into crisis in the 19th century, and then it seems like the old philosophy comes back, and yet in an altered form. Sociology, by contrast, is definitely a modern discipline. It's from not only the 19th century, it's really from the middle or late 19th century, meaning it's really only fully after the Industrial Revolution had taken place. It has some antecedents. I think that I mentioned that Rousseau is the sort of father of social theory, but social theory, social philosophy, would be different from sociology. And sociology understands itself as an empirical science. In other words, it's not meant to be speculative theory. It's not meant to be a social philosophy, especially because it's supposed to be objective. Sociology is supposed to be objective, whereas a social philosophy such as Rousseau's is clearly subjective. All right, so the very emergence of this discipline of sociology is itself a symptom. It's something that Lukács also addressed, namely that everything becomes statistical. Now, what he meant there was economics, primarily, but it's also been the case increasingly over the course of the last century that political science and sociology became quantitative in character. They became quantified in their methods. And so the theoretical or speculative or philosophical aspect progressively was eliminated. Right, so even our notion of science is very different from what Kant and Hegel thought it was, different even from like a kind of David Hume empiricism. So the positive sciences or positivism in science means the narrowing of the kinds of questions that science can ask. Right, it tends to eliminate the more speculative philosophical questions, and with them the ability to reflect on itself. So science loses this kind of self-reflexive character. Now, interestingly, he thinks the same thing happens in the East Bloc, meaning that when Marxism became an official ideology, it also took the same path of kind of positivism, and we could also say objectivism, and that this was a kind of degradation of Marxism. So Marxism itself, understood as like scientific socialism, followed the same course in the East as the positive sciences in the West did, even though supposedly Marxism was not supposed to be this akin to the positive sciences of the West. Actually thought of itself as qualitatively different. Yet it took the same course. Okay, so let's see how we're doing for time. All right, so subject and object. So this is the first. So this and the Marginalia to theory and praxis is divided up into sections. It's kind of a series of theses, but really a series of aphorisms, in fact. So he writes, to lead in with reflections about subject and object raises the difficulty of stating what exactly the topic of discussion should be. The terms are patently equivocal. The subject can refer to the particular individual as well as to universal attributes of consciousness in general, in the language of Kant's prolegomena. The equivocation cannot be removed simply through terminological clarification. For both meanings have reciprocal need of each other. One can hardly be comprehended without the other. No concept of the subject can have the element of individual humanity, what Schelling called egoity, separated from it in thought. Without any reference to it, subject would lose all significance. Conversely, the particular human individual, as soon as one reflects upon it under the guise of the universality of its concept, which does not signify merely some particular being, hic et nunc, but is already transformed into the universal. Similar to what was expressed in the idealist concept of the subject, even the expression particular person requires the concept of species simply in order to be meaningful. The relation of that universal still inheres implicitly in proper names. They designate someone who has such and such a name and no other, and someone stands elliptically for a person. On the other hand, if one wanted to escape complications of this kind by trying to define the two terms, then one would fall into an aporia that attends the problematic definition in modern philosophy since Kant. The concepts of subject and object, or rather what they refer to, have in a certain way priority over all definition. Defining means as much as subjectively, by means of a rigidly applied concept, capturing something objective, no matter what it may be in itself. Hence the resistance of subject and object to the act of defining. The determination of their meanings requires reflection on the very thing the act of defining truncates for the sake of conceptual manageability. Therefore, it is advisable to start by taking up the words subject and object, such as they are handed down by the well-honed philosophical language, as a historical sediment, not, of course, sticking to such conventionalism, but continuing further with a critical analysis. One could begin with the allegedly naive, though already quite mediated view that a knowing subject, whatever kind it may be, stands confronting an object of knowledge, whatever kind it may be. The reflection, which in philosophical terminology goes by the name of intentio obliqua, is then a relating from that ambiguous concept of object back to a no less ambiguous concept of subject. A second reflection reflects the first, more closely determining the vagueness for the sake of the contents of the concepts of subject and object. he continues that the separation of subject and object is both real and semblance, or real and appearance. True, because in the realm of cognition it lends expression to the real separation, the rivenness of the human condition, the result of a coercive historical process. Untrue, because the historical separation must not be hypostasized, not magically transformed into an invariant. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead here. So we're going to have time for us to get to the Marginalia and to Resignation. It says the insight, this is section 4, into the primacy of the object does not restore the old intentio recta, the slavish confidence in the external world existing precisely as it appears, this side of critique, an anthropological state devoid of the self-consciousness that first crystallizes in the context of the relationship leading from knowledge back to the knower. The crude confrontation of subject and object in naive realism is of course historically necessitated and cannot be dismissed by an act of will, but at the same time it is a product of false abstraction, already a piece of reification. Once this is seen through, then a consciousness objectified to itself and precisely as such directed outward, virtually striking outward, could no longer be dragged along without self-reflection. The turn to the subject, though from the outset intent on its primacy, does not simply disappear with its revision. This revision occurs not least of all in the subjective interest in freedom. The primacy of the object, so this is what we were talking about with negative dialectics, the primacy or preponderance of the object, means rather that subject for its part is object, in a qualitatively different, more radical sense than object, because object cannot be known except through consciousness, hence is also subject. What is known through consciousness must be something. Mediation applies to something mediated. But subject, the epitome of mediation, is the how, and never, as contrasted to the object, the what that is postulated by every conceivable idea for a concept of subject. Potentially, though not actually, objectivity can be conceived without a subject, but not likewise object without subjectivity. No matter how subject is defined, the existent being cannot be conjured away from it. If subject is not something, and something designates an irreducibly objective element, then it is nothing at all. Even as actus purus, it needs to refer to something that acts. Let me jump ahead here. Object is also mediated, but according to its own concept, it is not so thoroughly dependent upon subject as subject is dependent upon objectivity. He says, idealism ignored such a difference and thereby coarsened an intellectualization that functions as a disguise for abstraction. But this occasions a revision of the prevailing position towards the subject in traditional theory, which exalts the subject in ideology and defames it in epistemological praxis. If one wants to attain the object, however, then its subjective determinations or qualities are not to be eliminated. Precisely that would be contrary to the primacy of the object. If subject has a core of object, then the subjective qualities in the object are all the more an objective moment. For object becomes something at all only through being determinate. In the determinations that seem merely to be affixed to it by the subject's own objectivity comes to the fore. Even according to idealist doctrine, the subjective determinations are not merely an afterthought. They are also always required by what is to be determined. And in this, the primacy of the object asserts itself. Conversely, the supposedly pure object, free of any added thought or intuition, is the very reflection of abstract subjectivity, only it makes the other like itself through abstraction. Let me jump to the end of this section. Only the societal self-reflection of knowledge obtains that epistemological objectivity that escapes knowledge so long as it obeys the societal coercions at work in it and does not think through them. Critique of society is critique of knowledge, and vice versa. So critique of knowledge is also critique of society. The primacy of the object, this is section 5, can be discussed legitimately only when that primacy over the subject in the broadest sense of the term is somehow determinable, that is, more than the Kantian thing in itself as the unknown cause of phenomenal appearance. Despite Kant, to be sure, even the thing in itself bears a minimum of determination simply by being distinguished from what is predicated by the categories. One such determination of a negative kind would be that of acausality, so something that doesn't have a cause. It is sufficient to establish an antithesis to the conventional view that agrees with subjectivism. The primacy of the object proves itself in that it qualitatively alters the opinions of reified consciousness that are smoothly consistent with subjectivism. Subjectivism does not affect naive realism at the level of content, but rather simply attempts to provide formal criteria for its validity, as confirmed by the Kantian formula of empirical realism. One argument for the primacy of the object is indeed incompatible with Kant's doctrine of constitution, that in the modern natural sciences, ratio, or reason, peers over the wall it itself erects, that it snatches a snippet of what does not agree with its own ingrained categories. Such an expansion of reason unsettles subjectivism. But what determines the antecedent object, as distinct from its being trussed up by the subject, can be grasped in what for its part determines the categorial apparatus, by which the object is determined according to the subjectivist schema, namely in the conditionedness of what conditions the object. The categorial determinations, which according to Kant first bring about objectivity, are themselves something posited, and thus, as it were, really are merely subjective. The reductio ad hominem thus becomes the collapse of anthropocentrism. The fact that man as a constituens is in turn man-made disenchants the creationism of mind. But because the primacy of the object requires both reflection upon the subject and subjective reflection, subjectivity, differently than in the primitive materialism that actually does not permit dialectics, becomes a moment that is held fast. Okay, so again, subjectivity is objective because it is itself created. Namely, it only exists in society, it only exists in history. So even reduction, a reductio ad hominem, reduction to the human, or reduction to the person of the subject, actually ends up collapsing anthropocentrism, since one is reflecting on what has been constituted. Okay, the subject's reflection upon its own formalism, this is section 12, is reflection upon society, with the paradox that, following the intention of the later Durkheim, on the one hand the formative constituents originate in society, while on the other hand, as current epistemology can boast, they are objectively valid. In Durkheim's arguments, they are already presupposed in every proposition that demonstrates their conditionedness. So Durkheim is Émile Durkheim. He's a French sociologist. He's one of the classical sociologists. But he and Weber really established the modern practice of sociology at the turn of the 20th century. This paradox, he says, may well be one with the subject's objective captivity within itself. The cognitive function without which there would be neither difference nor unity of the subject. for its part, has arisen historically. It consists essentially in these formative constituents. To the extent that there is cognition, it must take place in accordance with them, even where it looks beyond them. They define the concept of cognition. Yet those formative constituents are not absolute, but rather a historical development like the cognitive function itself. It is not beyond the pale of possibility that they could disappear. To predicate their absoluteness would posit the cognitive function, the subject, as absolute. To relativize them would dogmatically revoke the cognitive function. To counter this, it is claimed that the argument involves a silly sociologism, that God created society and society created man, and God in man's image. But the anteriority thesis is absurd only so long as the individual or its biological prototype is hypostatized. In view of evolutionary history, it is more likely to assume the temporal prius, or at least to the simultaneous co-presence of the species. That the human being was there before the species is either a biblical echo or sheer Platonism. Nature at its lower stages is full of non-individuated organisms. If, as more recent biologists maintain, human beings in fact are born so much more ill-equipped than other creatures, then they probably could have survived only in association. Through rudimentary social labor, the principium individuationis is secondary to that, hypothetically, a kind of biological division of labor. It is improbable that some single human first emerged archetypically. The belief in such an emergence mythically projects the principium individuationis, now historically fully developed, backward onto the past, or onto the celestial realm of eternal ideas. The species may have individuated itself through mutation, in order then, through individuation, to reproduce itself in individuals by relying on biological singularity. The human being is a result, not a eidos. So that would be a kind of a principle or an origin. The insights of Hegel and Marx penetrate all the way into the inmost aspects of the so-called questions of constitution. The ontology of the human being, the model for the construction of the transcendental subject, is centered on the developed individual, as is indicated linguistically by the ambiguity in the article the, which names the species as well as the individual. To this extent, nominalism, much more than its opponent, ontology, includes the primacy of the species, of society. To be sure, ontology makes common cause with nominalism by at once denying the species, perhaps because it suggests animals. Ontology by exalting the individual into the form of unity and into a being in itself as opposed to the many. Nominalism by unreflectedly proclaiming the individual on the model of the human individual to be the true entity. It denies society and its concepts by degrading it into an abbreviation for the individual. Okay, so that helps us with, leads us into the Marginalia to theory and practice. Let's see how we're doing. Oh, we're getting very short on time. I'm going to look at a couple of things from the Marginalia to theory and practice, and then really turn to resignation. We'll concentrate on the parts of the Marginalia to theory and praxis that we need to get to the resignation essay. All right. All right. So Adorno writes, a simple consideration of history demonstrates just how much the question of theory and praxis depends upon the question of subject and object. At the same time as the Cartesian doctrine of two substances ratified the dichotomy of subject and object, literature for the first time portrayed praxis as a dubious undertaking on account of its tension with reflection. Despite all its eager realism, pure practical reason is devoid of object to the same degree that the world, for manufacturing and industry, becomes material devoid of quality and ready for processing, which in turn finds its legitimation nowhere else but in the marketplace. Whereas praxis promises to lead people out of their self-isolation, praxis itself always has been isolated. For this reason, practical people are unresponsive, and the relation of praxis to its object is a priori undermined. Indeed, one could ask whether, in its indifference towards its object, all nature-dominating praxis up to the present day is not in fact praxis in name only. Its illusory character is inherited by all the actions unreflectedly adopting the old violence gesture of praxis. Since its beginnings, American pragmatism has been criticized, with good reason, for consecrating the existing conditions by making the practical applicability of knowledge its criterion for knowledge. Supposedly nowhere else could the practical effectiveness of knowledge be tested. If in the end theory, which bears upon the totality, if it does not want to be futile, is tied down to its effectiveness here and now, then the same thing befalls it despite its belief that it escapes the immanence of the system. Theory steals itself back from the system's immanence only where it shirks its pragmatic fetters, no matter how modified they may be. All theory is gray. Goethe has Mephistopheles preach to the student he is leading around by the nose. The sentence was already ideology from the very beginning. Fraud about the fact that the tree of life the practicians planted, and the devil in the same breath compares to gold, is hardly green at all. The grayness of theory is for its part a function of the life that has been dequalified. Nothing should exist that cannot be fastened upon by both hands. Not thought. The subject thrown back on itself, divided from its other by an abyss, is supposedly incapable of action. Hamlet is as much the proto-history of the individual in its subjective reflection as it is the drama of the individual paralyzed into inaction by that reflection. So this is the famous soliloquy of Hamlet, Shakespeare. To be or not to be, that is the question. So really, it's about his status as a prince. So to be or not to be really means to act or not to act. Right? Is he going to be a prince, in which case he has to act like a prince? Right? But his inability to do so is really the substance of the drama. Meaning Hamlet, the character Hamlet, is a prince, he's an aristocrat, he's governed by rules of conduct, rules of action, and yet he's a bourgeois subject in the sense of being a free subject, not dictated simply by the morality of his caste. In his process of self-externalization towards what differs from him, the individual senses this discrepancy and is inhibited from completing the process. Only a little later, the novel describes, so the novel, after Shakespearean drama, the novel, as a form, describes how the individual reacts to the situation incorrectly termed alienation, as though the age before individualism enjoyed an intimacy which nonetheless can hardly be experienced other than by individuated beings. According to Burckhardt, animals are lonely communities. Let's see. Individual reacts to the situation incorrectly termed alienation with pseudo-activity. And we'll see what pseudo-activity is in the Resignation essay. The follies of Don Quixote are the attempts at compensation for the lost other. So Don Quixote is about the aristocrat who also doesn't know what to do in modern conditions and is tilting at windmills, thinking that they're dragons. In the language of psychiatry, it's a restitution phenomena. Or the follies of Don Quixote are a restitution phenomena. What since then has been called the problem of praxis, and today culminates in the question of the relation between theory and praxis, coincides in the question of the relation between, coincides or culminates in the question of the relation between theory and praxis, coincides with the loss of experience caused by the rationality of the eternally same. Where experience is blocked or altogether absent, praxis is damaged and therefore longed for, distorted and desperately overvalued. Thus, what is called the problem of praxis is interwoven with the problem of knowledge. Abstract subjectivity, in which the process of rationalization terminates, strictly speaking, can do just as little as the transcendental subject can conceivably have precisely what is attested to have, spontaneity. Okay. Let me jump ahead here. It would be too coarse a generalization, were one, for the sake of a historico-philosophical construction, to date the divergence between theory and praxis as late as the Renaissance. But the divergence was first reflected upon only after the collapse of that ordo that presumed to allocate the truth as well as good works their place in the hierarchy. So what is the ordo? That's the medieval order, the divine order of the great chain of being. So with bourgeois society, that collapses. In reality, that collapses in society. And he's tying the separation of theory and praxis to that event. Right? So when there was a caste system, when everything had its place in the hierarchy, there was no real distinction between theory and praxis. The crisis of praxis was experienced as not knowing what should be done. So again, the Hamlet, to be or not to be, to act or not to act, and what should one do? Not knowing what should be done. Together with the medieval hierarchy, which was connected to an elaborate casuistry, the practical guidelines disintegrated, which at that time, despite all their dubiousness, seemed at least to be suitable to the social structure. The much-attacked formalism of Kantian ethical theory was the culmination of a movement that began irresistibly and through legitimate critique with the emancipation of autonomous reason. The inability to engage in praxis was first and foremost the consciousness of a lack of regulative principles, a weakness from the very beginning. From this weakness comes the hesitation, akin to reason in the guise of contemplation, and the inhibition of praxis. The formal character of pure practical reason constituted its failure before praxis. To be sure, it also occasioned the self-reflection that leads beyond the culpable concept of praxis. If autarkic praxis has always manifested manic and compulsive traits, then self-reflection, on the other hand, signifies the interruption of action blindly directed outward. Non-naivete is the transition to the humane. Whoever does not want to romanticize the Middle Ages must trace the divergence between theory and praxis back to the oldest division between physical and intellectual labor, probably as far back as prehistoric obscurity. Praxis arose from labor. It attained its concept when labor no longer wanted to merely reproduce life directly, but to produce its conditions, and this clashed with the already existing conditions. Its descent from labor is a heavy burden for all praxis. To this day, it carries the baggage of an element of unfreedom. The fact that once it was necessary to struggle against the pleasure principle for the sake of one's own self-preservation, although labor that has been reduced to a minimum no longer needs to be tied to self-denial. Contemporary actionism also represses the fact that the longing for freedom is closely related to the aversion to praxis. Praxis was the reaction to deprivation. This still disfigures praxis even when it wants to do away with deprivation. To this extent, art is the critique of praxis as unfreedom. This is where its truth begins. With a shock, one can understand the abhorrence at the praxis so popular nowadays when one observes natural historical phenomena such as beaver dams, the industriousness of ants and bees, or the grotesque struggles of a beetle as it carries a blade of grass. Modern and ancient intertwine in praxis. Once again, praxis becomes a sacred animal. Just as in the time before recorded history, it was thought a sacrilege not to devote oneself body and soul to the efforts of preserving the species. The physiognomy of praxis is brute earnestness. This earnestness dissolves where the genius of praxis emancipates itself. This is surely what Schiller meant with his theory of play. This is Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man and his idea of the play drive. The majority of actionists are humorless in a way that is no less alarming than are those who laugh along with everyone. The lack of self-reflection derives not only from their psychology. It is the mark of a praxis that, having become its own fetish, becomes a barricade to its own goal. The dialectic is hopeless. That through praxis alone is it possible to escape the captivating spell praxis imposes on people, but that meanwhile, as praxis, it compulsively contributes to reinforcing the spell, obtuse, narrow-minded, as the farthest removed from spirit. The recent hostility toward theory, which animates the process, makes a program out of it. But the practical goal, which includes the liberation from all narrow-mindedness, is not indifferent to the means intended to achieve it. Otherwise, this dialectic would degenerate into vulgar Jesuitism. The idiotic parliamentarian in Doré's caricature who boasts, "Gentlemen, I am above all practical," reveals himself as a scoundrel who cannot see beyond the immediate tasks and moreover is proud of it. His behavior denounces the very spirit of praxis as a demon. Theory speaks for what is not narrow-minded. Despite all of its unfreedom, theory is the guarantor of freedom in the midst of unfreedom. All right, I'm going to now turn to the Resignation article because it's a sort of a shorter treatment of some similar themes. But before that, let's look at the final section of the Marginalia to Theory and Praxis. Okay, so he says the stale Marxist pun about critical critique, the witlessly pleonastic hackneyed witticism that believes theory is annihilated because it is theory, merely conceals the insecurity involved in the direct translation of theory into praxis. And even later, despite the Internationale, the first International that is, with whom he had a falling out, Marx by no means surrendered himself to praxis. Praxis is a source of power for theory, but cannot be prescribed by it. It appears in theory merely and indeed necessarily as a blind spot, as an obsession with with what is being criticized. No critical theory can be practiced in particular detail without overestimating the particular. But without the particularity, it would be nothing. This admixture of delusion, however, warns of the excesses in which it incessantly grows. Okay, so that's a little bit of an opaque final two sentences. But the idea is that the meaning of theory and the meaning of practice is to be found in their separation and alienation, and even in their antagonism. Okay, and finally, resignation. Which ended up being, not intentionally, but ended up being the last thing that Adorno wrote for publication before he suffered a heart attack and died while hiking in the Alps on vacation after the end of the school year. He writes, "We older representatives of what the name Frankfurt School has come to designate have recently and eagerly been accused of resignation. We had indeed developed elements of a critical theory of society," the accusation runs, "but we were not ready to draw the practical consequences from it. And so we neither provided actionist programs, nor did we even support actions by those who felt inspired by critical theory. I will not address the question of whether that can be demanded from theoretical thinkers. who are relatively sensitive and by no means shock-proof instruments. The purpose that has fallen to them in a society based on the division of labor may be questionable. They themselves may be deformed by it, but they are also formed by it. Of course, they could not by sheer will abolish what they have become. I do not want to deny the element of subjective weakness that clings to the narrowed focus on theory. I think the objective side is more important. The objection, effortlessly rattled off, runs along these lines. The person who at this hour doubts the possibility of radical change in society and who therefore neither participates in spectacular violent actions nor recommends them has resigned. What he has in mind he thinks he cannot be realized. Actually, he does not even want to realize it. By leaving the conditions untouched, he condones them without admitting it. Distance from praxis is disreputable to everyone. Whoever doesn't want to really knuckle down and get his hands dirty is suspect, as though the aversion were not legitimate and only distorted by privilege. The distrust of whoever distrusts praxis extends from those on the opposite side who repeat this old slogan, "Enough talking already," all the way to the objective spirit of advertising that propagates the image. They call it the guiding image of the active, practical person. Be he an industrial leader or an athlete, one should join in. Whoever only thinks removes himself, is considered weak, cowardly, virtually a traitor. The hostile cliché of the intellectual works its way deeply into the oppositional group without them having noticed it, and who in turn are slandered as intellectuals. Thinking actionists answer, among the things to be changed include precisely the present conditions of the separation of theory and praxis. Praxis is needed, they say, precisely in order to do away with the domination by practical people and the practical ideal. But then this is quickly transformed into a prohibition on thinking. A minimum is sufficient to turn the resistance to repression, repressively against those who, as little as they wish to glorify their individual being, nonetheless do not renounce what they have become. The much invoked unity of theory and praxis has the tendency of slipping into the predominance of praxis. Many movements defame theory itself as a form of oppression, as though praxis were not much more directly related to oppression. In Marx, the doctrine of this unity was inspired by the real possibility of action, which even at that time was not actualized. Today, what is emerging is more the direct contrary. One clings to action for the sake of the impossibility of action. Admittedly, already in Marx there lies concealed a wound. He may have presented the 11th thesis on Feuerbach so authoritatively because he knew he wasn't entirely sure about it. In his youth he had demanded the ruthless criticism of everything existing. Now he was mocking criticism. But his famous witticism against the young Hegelians, the phrase critical critique, was a dud, one up in smoke as nothing but a tautology. The forced primacy of praxis irrationally stopped the critique that Marx himself practiced. In Russia, and in the orthodoxy of other countries, the malicious derision of critical critique became an instrument so that the existing conditions could establish themselves so terrifyingly. The only thing praxis still meant was increased production of the means of production. Critique was not tolerated anymore except for the criticism that people were not yet working hard enough. So easily does the subordination of theory to praxis invert into service rendered to renewed oppression. The repressive intolerance to the thought that is not immediately accompanied by instructions for action is founded on anxiety. Untrammeled thought, uninhibited thought, and the posture that will not let itself be bargained away must be feared because of what one deeply knows but cannot admit, that the thought is right. An age-old bourgeois mechanism with which the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers were quite familiar operates once again, but unchanged. The suffering caused by a negative situation, this time by obstructed reality, becomes rage leveled at the person who expresses it. Thought, enlightenment conscious of itself, threatens to disenchant the pseudo-reality within which actionism moves, in the words of Habermas, who is Adorno's student. The actionism is tolerated only because it is considered pseudo-reality. Pseudo-reality is conjoined with, as its subjective attitude, pseudo-activity, action that overdoes and aggravates itself for the sake of its own publicity, without admitting to itself to what extent it serves as a substitute satisfaction, elevating itself into an end in itself. People locked in desperately want to get out. In such situations, one doesn't think anymore, or does so only under fictive premises. Within absolutized praxis, only reaction is possible and therefore false. Only thinking can find an exit, and moreover a thinking whose results are not stipulated, as is so often the case in discussions in which it is already settled who should be right. Discussions that therefore do not advance the cause but rather inevitably degenerate into tactics. If the doors are barricaded, then thought more than ever should not stop short. It should analyze the reasons and subsequently draw the conclusions. It is up to thought not to accept the situation as final. The situation can be changed, if at all, by undiminished insight. The leap into praxis does not cure the thought of resignation, as long as it is paid for with the secret knowledge that that really isn't the right way to go. Pseudoactivity is generally the attempt to rescue enclaves of immediacy in the midst of a thoroughly mediated and rigidified society. Such attempts are rationalized by saying that the small change is one step in the long path towards the transformation of the whole. The disastrous model of pseudoactivity is the do-it-yourself. Activities that do what has long been done better by the means of industrial production, only in order to inspire in the unfree individuals, paralyzed in their spontaneity, the assurance that everything depends on them. The nonsense of do-it-yourself in the production of material goods, even in the carrying out of many repairs, is patently obvious. Admittedly, the nonsense is not total. With the reduction of so-called services, sometimes measures carried out by the private person that are superfluous considering the available technology, nonetheless fulfill a quasi-rational purpose. The do-it-yourself approach in politics is not completely of the same caliber. The society that impenetrably confronts people is nonetheless these very people. The trust in the limited action of small groups recalls the spontaneity that withers beneath the encrusted totality, and without which this totality cannot become something different. The administered world has the tendency to strangle all spontaneity, or at least to channel it into pseudo-activities. At least this does not function as smoothly as the agents of the administered world would hope. However, spontaneity should not be absolutized, just as little as it should be split off from the objective situation or idolized the way the administrative world itself is. Otherwise, the axe in the house that never saves the carpenter will smash in the nearest door and the riot squad will be at the ready. Even political undertakings can sink into pseudo-activities, into theater. It is no coincidence that the ideals of immediate action, even the propaganda of the act, have been that's the propaganda of the deed. That is a kind of anarchist, terrorist idea. Have been resurrected after the willing integration of formerly progressive organizations that now in all countries of the earth are developing the characteristic traits of what they once opposed. So he's talking about the socialist and communist parties that became bulwarks of the status quo. Yet this does not invalidate the critique of anarchism. Its return is that of a ghost. The impatience with theory that manifests itself in its return does not advance thought beyond itself. By forgetting thought, the impatience falls back below it. This is made easier for the individual by his capitulation to the collective with which he identifies himself. He is spared from recognizing his powerlessness. The few become the many in their own eyes. This act, not unwavering thought, is resignative. No transparent relationship obtains between the interests of the ego and the collective it surrenders itself to. The ego must abolish itself so that it may be blessed with the grace of being chosen by the collective. Tacitly, a hardly Kantian categorical imperative has erected itself. You must sign. The sense of a new security is purchased with the sacrifice of autonomous thinking. The consolation that thinking improves in the context of collective action is deceptive. Thinking, as a mere instrument of activist actions, atrophies like all instrumental reason. At this time, no higher form of society is concretely visible. For that reason, whatever acts as though it were in easy reach has something regressive about it. But according to Freud, whoever regresses has not attained his instinctual aim. Objectively, regression is renunciation. even when it thinks itself the opposite and innocently propagates the pleasure principle. By contrast, the uncompromisingly critical thinker, who neither signs over his consciousness nor lets himself be terrorized into action, is in truth the one who does not give in. Thinking is not the intellectual reproduction of what already exists anyway. As long as it doesn't break off, thinking has a secure hold on possibility. Its insatiable aspect, its aversion to being quickly and easily satisfied, refuses the foolish wisdom of resignation. The utopian moment in thinking is stronger, the less it, this too a form of relapse, objectifies itself into a utopia and hence sabotages its own realization. Open thinking points beyond itself, for its part a comportment, a form of praxis. It is more akin to transformative praxis than a comportment that is compliant for the sake of praxis. Prior to all particular content, thinking is actually the force of resistance, from which it has been alienated only with great effort. Such an emphatic concept of thinking admittedly is not secured, not by the existing conditions, nor by ends yet to be achieved, nor by any kinds of battalions. Whatever has once been thought can be suppressed, forgotten, can vanish. But it cannot be denied that something of it survives, for thinking has the element of the universal. What once was thought cogently must be thought elsewhere, by others. This confidence accompanies even the most solitary and powerless thought. Whoever thinks is not enraged in all his critique. Thinking has sublimated the rage. Because the thinking person does not need to inflict rage upon himself, he does not wish to inflict it on others. The happiness that dawns in the eye of the thinking person is the happiness of humanity. The universal tendency of oppression is opposed to thought as such. Thought is happiness, even where it defines unhappiness, by enunciating it. By this alone, happiness reaches into the universal unhappiness. Whoever does not let it atrophy has not resigned. Okay, that brings us to the conclusion of our course material. I will look forward to your papers. If you have any questions about those, please write me. Write me an email, I'll get back to you. And I wish you guys a good end of the summer. I hope you are able to take advantage of the break. And I'll maybe see some of you in classes in the future during the new school year.
Thank you.
All right, take good care, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.